It is December 9th, and we're here in the Austin Reading Room in the Nicholson Library with Debbie Harmon Ferry, Dave Hansen, a legacy of Linfield knowledge and information here. And we're going to start today by asking the usual question we start with, which is, why Linfield? What brought you here, and what keeps you here? And I can start either one of you.
First.
I was in graduate school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at Carnegie Mellon Institute, and was desperate to get back to the West Coast. I'm a Portland person. The range of schools in which I was interested was relatively narrow. I was interested in small private liberal arts schools in Oregon, and that meant it was very limited. And in late 1968, I got a call that there was an opening in the area I happened to teach at Linfield. And for me, it was a way to get back to the West Coast. I came not thinking I would be here very long, and as you now know, it's been 43 years. And, so it worked out very, very well.
And I don't know how much of a conscious choice it was for me. We came to Linfield when I was around 1, and I grew up here as a faculty child. Eventually I did go to college somewhere else, and that didn't last. I just compared everything to Linfield, and I lasted a year and then transferred and completed my education here at Linfield. So I graduated here. I left again and went to work somewhere else, and that too was short-lived. And so when a job opened up at Linfield, I came back in a temporary position for a year. After another year and a half away, came back and have been back ever since. So I think I keep being pulled in. It just seems like home to me. So.
What about you, Dave? What keeps you? What kept you here beyond what you thought would be a short term?
Well, you know, I'm doing what I love best, and that's teaching students. And it was a great place to raise kids. Both of my children grew up on campus. I love the community. I got involved in a number of activities around the community. And I just felt like it was a great fit for me in terms of being able not only to teach students, but to interact with them outside the classroom.
So I think what we want to know next is digging into the family dynamic more. So what was it like having your dad work here? And then, of course, what was it like having your daughter work here? And then as both adults being administrators and then faculty and an administrator?
Well, when I first came, I was a student and he was a professor. And when I decided to transfer, I thought, it's no big deal because he teaches economics. I'm never going to take economics. I'll hardly see him. And I think the first year that was largely true. But after my first year, he was offered the position of Dean of Students. And by that time, I'd been hired as an RA, which worked in the housing office, which was within student services. So saw him quite a bit, even my junior and senior year of college. And that wasn't bad, but it was at least interesting because Dean of Students is sometimes the disciplinarian. And so lots of people would grumble about, oh, that Hansen character. And I thought, do I tell them or just sit silently, I think. So that was an interesting dynamic there. But I kind of think I got used to that. So by the time we were both working here, it didn't seem that odd to me. I think it may seem funny for other people sometimes. And in meetings, I tried to be professional. So rather than saying, well, as Dad says, I know I'd often say, well, as Dave said earlier, but there was always that half pause because it seemed a little funny and people would chuckle around the table because most people at Linfield knew he's my dad. It's more often the case that people coming in, like maybe for an interview or something, wouldn't know the connection, and we don't necessarily divulge it right away, kind of wanting to each stand on our own merits. I just don't want people to think, wow, she got the job because she's Dave's kid. I'd rather they know me first, and then if they find out, I'm certainly not trying to hide it.
For my part, Debbie's mother and I thought that I was such a presence on campus that it would be really good for her to go away somewhere to school. And as she mentioned, she did that her first year. She knew before we did that she really was meant to be at Linfield, and so she transferred back. For the most part, I didn't see her very often. Indeed, as she mentioned, being in the residence life staff that first year that she came back, we came to Parents' Weekend one time and did not see her throughout the weekend. She was off busy doing other things. Really the only time I was very much aware that Debbie was anywhere on campus is that I used to park my car in a particular location, and when I went out at noon to go to lunch or at the end of the day to go home, the car was often missing. And I had wrestled with whether to tell the police or call Debbie. As she mentioned, we generally don't acknowledge that we're related to one another. We let people discover that, and from time to time we have a lot of fun with that.
Now, my worst story was when I was a student in RA training. Do you remember the story that I'm talking about?
Well, I don't know the story yet.
So they had the dean of students one day come and talk to the new RA class, as it was, and we'd been hired and we were getting ready to start fall semester. And he came in and was saying, now, in order to be RAs, you're getting, I don't know what it was, room and board or something like that. And in order to do that, we're asking you to take care of public policy and college policy and enforce the rules.
And obey the rules.
And so he drew a picture of a beer bottle on the chalkboard and then drew $2,000 or whatever the stipend was equivalent. And he said, there are going to be times when you're going to be tempted and say, do I want one of these? I want to remind you about this. And he circled the stipend. This or this? And if you're still having trouble with that decision, here's my phone number. Give me a call. And after the class, it was dead silent, and all the other RAs came up to me and said, was he kidding? Oh, no, not at all. No. I do remember that.
What made you, when you were offered the job as dean of students, did you wrestle with that decision at all?
I did a little bit. It was an interesting period of time. I had been the chairman of the then Department of Economics and Business. It was Linfield's largest student department for about 9 or 10 years. And we discovered in some archaic piece of literature that there was a term limit of 6 years. And so I had to release that position and go back to full-time teaching. I got a couple classes off for being the department chair. And in order to go back to a full-time teaching load, it would have meant that I would have to bump some other younger faculty out of a course that I wanted to teach. I was nervous about that. That didn't seem to me to be a very good thing to do. And the then dean of students cornered me in a hallway one day and said, well, would you be interested in doing some work over in student services? And it resolved an issue that was going to be thorny. It avoided a midlife crisis. It gave me a new challenge. I enjoyed working with students a lot. And so I took a position as essentially an associate dean at that point. I had been in that position for about 6 months when he had a health issue that forced him to leave the job. And I was invited to apply for the job and became the dean, I think, in 1988.
And you, in retrospect, that was a decision that you're happy you made?
I am. I think my greatest strength is in the classroom. I enjoy classroom teaching and that sort of connection to students. But being dean gave me access to a wider variety of students, a larger number of students. It got me on the fringe of some decision making on campus that had an impact on the way Linfield emerged. So I've never regretted doing that. One of the interesting things is I chose as a matter of my decision to continue teaching throughout the time I was Dean of Students or Vice President for Student Affairs. I continued to teach at a minimum 1 class a semester, which I've always enjoyed.
Excellent. And the disciplinary role of the position I know can wear on people. Was that something that you found was tough to deal with?
I think it's the hardest portion of the job, and it's sometimes never pleasant, but you have to see discipline in an educational mode. And we saw it as an experience for students to learn. We saw it as an experience for students to mature and be responsible for their own behavior, become more of an adult. And if you can keep it in that framework and keep personalities out of it and keep the anger to a minimum, it works out okay.
So one thing that Rich and I have talked about is, given both of your tenures here, how much cultural change and even the different personalities of the presidents who have come in. I believe Bjork was here when you started, Dave?
President Bjork was the president that hired me. And I've worked for 7 different presidents, 3 of them short term. The biggest change for me at Linfield has been primarily the physical change, because you can see a before picture and an after picture and compare the two pretty clearly. The changes in students have happened more marginally over time and a little shift at a time. In my first several years in the classroom, I think that students in those days were a little more concerned about shaping the world, having an impact on society, gaining in cultural ways. Students in more recent years, because of the nature of the economy, have been more interested in employment opportunities. So the attitude of students and their primary goals have changed a little bit. I think that over time, students have become better prepared. We have better students now than we did then, although I think students in the earlier years probably were forced as a consequence to work harder. They really put in a lot of time and effort on their studies.
I think I was thinking about changes over the years, and I think there are a number of different things. Resources, and we can always use more resources, but certainly it feels like we've got more than we did when
Absolutely.
we were new here. And I must admit, I watched the Walkers interviews that you have, but I'd already remembered one of my favorite stories is I can think back to when you were a younger faculty member and we as a family came and cleaned the dorms because they didn't have enough money to have full cleaning staff, and so we cleaned Mac Hall, and I remember it
Before
vividly.
school began, the week before school began.
So a whole bunch of faculty members and their family showed up to clean the residence halls before the start of school, and I think if we tried that today. So in a way, resources have changed, which have been for the better, but also then the demands on faculty are different. I mean, we would never ask faculty to do that now, but also we seek a lot more in terms of publishing and that kind of thing that I don't think we had as much of 30 years ago.
And one of the other differences is that almost all faculty, when I first came, when Debbie first was born, lived on or near the campus. There were very few commuters. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, there was a stronger sense of family and community because you saw everybody's kids on campus. That has changed a little over time.
And either because that change or the size change. I mean, there are some people that I do see at employee gatherings that I don't know, and that still surprises me to this day because we used to know everybody on campus. And I don't think that's a function of my position. I think that we've grown a little bit through the years. The other thing that I've noticed, and that just may be my position, is the role of parents at a college is very different than it used to be. And a lot of that has to do with cell phones and the age of technology, email and cell phones. I mean, they're sort of ever present in a way that they weren't even 20 years ago.
When Debbie was a student, if students wanted to talk to their parents, they did it on the phone in the middle of the hall, in the residence hall. That made for very public conversation, so you didn't get a lot of conversations between parents.
And it cost money every time you wanted to call. Somebody paid for it on a payphone.
In today's communication environment, where it's pretty constant and daily, it's a very different atmosphere.
That was actually one of the kind of the questions we were going to ask about was sort of the rise of the internet age here at Linfield, and it was something that we talked about with Vivian especially because she was here kind of as the internet was becoming a thing. But is there besides the sort of cell phone, is there what can you tell us about kind of the technological changes at Linfield? I
can tell you that the first time I heard of the World Wide Web was in a meeting in Melrose Auditorium with prospective students and parents, and a parent asked a question about the web. And I became a little bit panicky because I had no concept what the web was. Thank goodness Vivian Bull was very familiar with the web. This was before the campus was well wired, as you might imagine, so it's made a huge difference. I can remember when computers became an important resource on campus thinking, well, I'm close enough to the end of my career that maybe I won't have to learn how to do that. Well, guess what? Good luck. So there's certainly been a rather remarkable revolution in technology on campus. We couldn't do much of what we do in the absence of having technical support that we have. And multimedia kinds of presentations just were, I used to publish my exams on a mimeograph machine with purple ink. I'm just stunned at and I still keep those, by the way, but I'm stunned at some of the things that we had to do in the absence of current technology.
I can remember being a student in the late 80s and there were computer labs. So students didn't own their own computers, but you went to a physical facility on campus, and this one was in the basement of Graff Hall, where there'd be 30 or 40 students at any given time, each working at a station. And I can remember, there'd be a power surge or something, and everyone in the room, oh, because we all would have lost the last half an hour's worth of work. And that's so foreign to the students today. They can't imagine that you'd have to go across campus to get on a computer. So it's certainly more convenient now, and the access to information is different. The access in terms of friends, Facebook, I think of our students, they don't lose track of their friends from high school quite the same way that some of us did. But there's also an immediacy effect that I think people are used to. And in my job, we'll have events and we have online registration, which is wonderful, but people will register 5 minutes before the event, not understanding that I've printed all the lists, I've already called the caterer, a week ago, the event is already happening. I don't get that information, even though you feel like you've sent it to me, so it's a little different.
Well, internet and technology were huge cultural shifts, technology shifts. Also, Title IX was happening I believe during both of your tenures. Could either of you speak to how that sort of changed on campus or affected campus?
When I came to campus, there were reduced number of athletic opportunities for both men and women. There were very few women's teams. There was a basketball team. I don't think in those days there may have even been a softball team. Field hockey was probably the principal female sport in those days. Linfield has expanded the number of teams and the variety of sports that they have, and the numbers of opportunities for students rather remarkably. And they've always been successful in certain sports, as you know, remarkably so. And the rise of women's sports, especially in the last 10 or 20 years, with the success of the tennis team that won 100 straight matches at one point for the women, the softball team that won, I think, 11 straight league titles, has been rather remarkable.
What about different kind of diversity on campus? But we spoke with both presidents about how much diversity has expanded on campuses everywhere, but on Linfield's campus especially, and the kind of challenges and opportunities that come from that. Is there anything in your experience that sort of speaks to the kind of, diversity has come a long ways on college campuses?
In terms of ethnic diversity, Linfield in the 1970s had considerable ethnic diversity because we had established a pipeline with Hartford, Connecticut. I do not know how that pipeline got started, but there were a number of African American students who came to Linfield, probably more at that time than in the 80s and 90s, percentage-wise. We've always had a very strong tie with Pacific Islanders, especially Hawaiians, and so that's always been an ethnic strain for Linfield. In the 1980s, somehow we lost some of that diversity, ethnic diversity, and I think it was principally because of the cost of education made it really unaffordable for many families in America. And a group of alums, I don't remember now, in the 80s, maybe the 90s, said we need to get back to that and helped us recreate some environments that allowed us to better serve ethnic minorities on campus, and we've made an effort to expand that. There was a time that I'm not sure there were any African American students who were not athletes. That was our source of African American students. The other thing is the international diversity for me has been a rather remarkable change, and that began somewhere in the 1970s and has expanded. We used to talk about the 5 programs Linfield has abroad. Now I think it's probably 15 or 20, and students can go to any country essentially on their own. So that's been an important element of diversity. We have had, I think, some degree of political diversity over the years, and that for me makes the campus much more interesting. We've had some degree of economic diversity, although the cost of private education these days is making that more and more difficult to sustain.
I would concur, and I think that we talk about international diversity. Certainly there are more students now from more different countries, but I can remember even as a child, we'd go visit students who were here from Iran and go to their homes for dinner, or we had a German choir come through and we'd host a couple of members for dinner, or maybe it was overnight. So that's long been part of the Linfield fiber. I just think the numbers and percentage may have changed. And I'd agree that either cultural or political diversity is very different than it used to be. And I think that might be a reflection of McMinnville itself changing. Since our home campus is in McMinnville, it used to be much more rural when we arrived. I think when we came there were 9,000 people.
In McMinnville, maybe 900 on campus.
Yeah, so it was a lot smaller. It was more of a farming community, but with maybe particularly the wine industry changing kind of the dynamics in the city. I feel like we have a broader spectrum of folks in McMinnville as well as at Linfield that may make it a different, more welcoming environment for a broader spectrum of political thought.
The Iranian dinner, by the way, was not a huge success for either Debbie or I. In their culture, they prefer that you eat with the right hand. Debbie and I are both left-handers, and it was quite messy.
To follow up on that, talking about McMinnville, I think one of the most things that struck me the most since I've gotten here is the connection between McMinnville and Linfield, the pure college town, I think the support that McMinnville has for Linfield, and historical support. I mean, going all the way back to the beginning of McMinnville College. What have you noticed of that? Is that something that does that seem extraordinary to you as well here compared to other places?
To me, it's normal because I've always been at Linfield. I'm always surprised when I talk to people at other institutions that there isn't a stronger relationship between the community and the college. McMinnvillians believe they own the college and treat it that way. They take great pride in it. And that's always been the case. We have a program, as I think you know, called Partners in Progress that always has been a major supporter of Linfield College. The folk in town appreciate having the college here as a center of athletics, a center of cultural events, a center of artistic events, and support the college because of that. I'm just so unfamiliar with other institutions. It's hard for me to imagine any other way to do it.
And all I know is when I went away to college, I went to Whitworth, which is in Spokane. Well, Whitworth is in Spokane, but so is Gonzaga, and Eastern Washington is not very far. So it wasn't a one-college town. And if anything, I think Whitworth was kind of the quieter ones because we were the north end of town, so we weren't, you know, Spokane's college. So it was a very different feel, and it reminded me of how special it is that we have this with McMinnville and Linfield. And then talking to folks at Willamette, they're so jealous of our Partners in Progress campaign because it's a far bigger town. You'd think it would be easier to be successful in that way, and yet folks there don't embrace the college in quite the same way that McMinnville folks embrace Linfield.
There's no sense of ownership.
Yeah. You can't be out in the city of McMinnville without people saying, oh, how's the team doing, or what do you hear, or how are things going on campus, when's the next play coming up, that kind of thing. So it's neat.
It seems like it's the perfectly sized city and college, the perfect size ratio.
It is, and it's held. As we said, when we first came, Linfield had 900 students. The town's about 9,000. There was, I think, one stoplight in town. There was one elevator in town. So the town has expanded. Now it's about 34,000. The college is larger than it was at that time, but it's remained a relatively important ratio of the town that it has significance.
I'd like to take the community question one step further in that, of course, the wine industry has exploded, especially in this area. How have you seen that shift? Both of you can speak to it, of course, because IPNC was held here in '87. How did attitudes change on campus, or did they? And how did that partnership develop, and perhaps where will it develop?
When I became Dean of Students, the first thing I found in a file was a document from 1934. It was a document that indicated a student had been expelled from the school because he'd been seen smoking while mowing the lawn at his house across town. So Linfield in those days had a slightly different attitude about certain things. Among those would have been alcohol. We tried for years and years to not allow alcohol on campus in any way, shape, or form. As we've learned a little bit about how to better deal with that and minimize damage and so forth, we've relaxed those rules. And the idea that Linfield would have any relationship to the wine industry when the wine industry first began was far from anybody's mind. There are former presidents that would roll over in their grave if they knew exactly how that worked out. Fortunately, recent presidents have seen the wine industry as an opportunity for Linfield to establish an important partnership for the community. And I think it's been a very strong program for us. I understand we're actually starting some educational academic programs that will assist that industry. It makes sense given our geographical location, but there's been a rather remarkable shift in public attitude about students and alcohol, wine, and the wine industry.
I think I see that most because as Director of Alumni, I encounter alums from many different generations, and they hold different views and beliefs about whether or not that's a positive for us. And I think people are coming around, but that was foreign for a lot of people who were here in the 50s, let's say, when it was a very different treatment on campus of, that, you know, it was a place where you shouldn't have alcohol at all. So the fact that we have the IPNC festival, or that we now have a program in the wine industry is a little surprising. But I think when we talk about the partnership there and how that can benefit students and the college itself, I think folks are seeing the values in that now.
It was probably in the 1980s that Sean Chin, a student from China, was one of our resident advisors, and he wanted to have a very fancy and formal dinner in one of the residence halls, and he wanted to serve wine. In those days, alcohol on campus was absolutely prohibited, on paper at least. Didn't mean it didn't exist. We actually had to take a proposal to the Board of Trustees in a special meeting of the Board of Trustees to allow him to serve wine at a formal dinner. So times have changed.
And now, you know, we have there's a dinner almost annually that we hold in the library where wine is served, and still some of the people that come to that, their eyes get big and they're, wait, we're serving wine?
Depending how far back they go.
Yes.
Well, I hope that was Oregon wine at least. So, one of the kind of final questions on kind of the culture that we were thinking about with, since Dave, you were here in the 70s and you saw kind of the shift away from sort of the trust of leadership, the trust of political leaders, the trust of, you know, with post-Vietnam, post-Watergate. I'm curious if that manifested itself any way at Linfield, if you noticed a shift in students becoming more cynical, becoming more pessimistic, becoming more anti-authority in any way?
Especially in my early years, the student body was remarkably conservative, and certainly more conservative even than the faculty. In the Vietnam War era, I remember being quite stunned but very proud that Linfield students chose with faculty to put together a peace march that went downtown on the occasion of the invasion of Cambodia. Students over time, I think, have tended to become slightly more liberal, although during the Sagebrush Rebellion, they've gone back and forth. That's why I say I kind of like the political diversity we have, because it leads to some interesting conversations and opening up of different viewpoints. Students, I think, are by nature modestly distrustful of college administrations. Again, not as distrustful as faculty tend to be, but distrustful nonetheless. But Linfield is such a family community atmosphere that we're generally able to work those things out fairly well.
I think we'd like to know what it was like working with the different presidents throughout your time, and then of course your perspective as a student, Debbie. What were some of the major takeaways from each president, or how did they affect you, depending on what your role was at the time?
My first president was Gordon Bjork. He was the president who hired me. I was hired sight unseen over the telephone. We've completely revamped that whole hiring process as a consequence of what occurred. I was the last person so hired. Gordon was at the college at a difficult time for Linfield College. Resources were scarce, the economy was bad, Linfield was struggling literally to survive. And Gordon at least was able to find some plans and mechanisms to give the college some hope. In particular, I'm thinking of the idea of merit scholarships rather than need scholarships. That was an important idea. He helped us change our curriculum, all for the better, on at least 2 different occasions. When Gordon left, Neil Siemens came on for 1 year. He was a hold the fort, tighten the ship down kind of a guy. He helped us control our expenses and get better control of our fiscal arrangements. Win Dolan was twice an interim president, both for very brief periods of time. At that time, he was so Mr. Linfield in every way that things went very well. I remember thinking when I first came, Win was old. He's much younger than I was when I stopped teaching, as it turns out. He had been here for 40 years. I've now been here 43 and have taught over 6 different decades. But I remember thinking of him in very reverent terms, and so I always appreciated Win. Charlie Walker may have well saved the college in terms of his financial situation. There was a theory that Charlie would walk around campus and strike the ground with a stick and a building would prop up. Vivian Bull had a very different leadership style than Dr. Walker. Dr. Walker was much more of a hands-on, let me help you, guide you to a decision, than Vivian. Viv would give you a task and an assignment and expect you to get it done, which I very much appreciated. Tom Helly, different again from either of the other 2 people that were here for the major portion of my time here. Tom, I think, has a very nice public presence. Conveys a feeling of confidence and stability. I have enjoyed working, most of my time was with Dr. Walker, Dr. Bull, and then with Dr. Helly. Very different management styles, and I've had to adapt each, but I've enjoyed each.
And Walker was my president when I was a student, so I remember him very fondly in that way. And he seems presidential to me. He's sort of formal in the way he carries himself. Maybe his age and the way that he speaks seems like someone you just need to respect. But he always knew my name when I was a student. I was very impressed with that. And so when I came to interview at Linfield, I came to interview for an admissions counselor entry-level job. I had 8 hours worth of interview, including a half an hour with President Walker. I was terrified to meet with him, and to this day I can remember him saying to me, do you think we should require volunteer service of our students? And I was so smart at 22 or whatever, and I said, no, because then it wouldn't be worth anything. I mean, the thing about volunteer service that's so great is you're volunteering. It's your choice to do that. Well, we require classes. Does that mean they're not worth anything? And I was just, oh my gosh, I've ruined it. I'll never get the job. And I mean, I still remember that was 20 some years ago. But I've had a fond place in my heart for President Walker. And then Vivian Bull came, and I remember her style being so different. But
she wore tennis shoes.
She wore tennis shoes. I would come to events, and if she didn't like what she saw, she'd whip out the vacuum and start vacuuming. And I was like, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. I'll do that. But amazing stamina. The woman could work all day long, from 6 in the morning till 9 at night, and not seem to ever
without any apparent
tire.
need for sleep.
Never slept. She would sleep for 10 minutes in the car on the way to Portland and then be ready to go again. And I can remember being pregnant with my first child. We were taking a trip to San Francisco to see donors and alumni, and we had maybe 3 or 4 visits already on the day, and it was probably 6 or 7 at night. And I said, well, are we going to stop for food, Vivian? And she said, well, I'm okay. And I was like, no, we aren't going to stop for food. So I think, she could go longer than I could, and I was at least half her age. So I was so impressed with her in that way. And then I was thrilled when I found out that Tom Helly was coming, because he's a runner and his background's in theater. So I thought this bode very well. So again, a very different style than the other two, but seems exactly what Linfield needed at that time. Really thoughtful, I think, about things, and a good leader.
We're curious about sort of the perception of Linfield and the perception of higher education in general. How the perception of Linfield has changed over time from the area, but also from sort of the Northwest and national perspective on Linfield. Does the national perspective even know that Linfield exists necessarily? Sort of how that has changed over the time you've been here.
Sure. I think for years we've been actively working to try and change the perception, in the sense that for years our tagline was sort of, we're the best kept secret, and we finally got tired of being a secret. Like, maybe that's not such a good thing. I know my son asked me the other day, is Linfield the best known college in all of Oregon? And I just didn't even know how to answer that question. I said, well, probably not. We're certainly known for athletics, which is great. We've had a long history of success in athletics. But what else are we known for? Who are we known by? And I think we're very well known regionally, at least. But nationally, probably a Reed or a Lewis and Clark is better known than Linfield at this point. But I think, rather than trying to be the best kept secret, we are trying to make sure folks know about Linfield, and admission has worked very hard to make efforts there, and visited a lot of different states to try and get the word out. And we have something fabulous here, and people should know about it. But because we're relatively small and in a small town, I think that's worked against us in terms of notoriety or folks knowing about us. I also think that the name is a little bit challenging, because if you look at the other colleges in the Northwest, they're named after other things. I mean, Willamette has a river, or Lewis and Clark are explorers that everyone knows. So you hear the name of the college and you think, oh yes, I'm familiar with them. But when you hear Linfield, not many people knew of Francis Ross Linfield or George Fisher Linfield, so it doesn't ring a bell quite as quickly.
In the 1970s, the major newspaper in Portland used to publish a list of colleges based on what they were the best at. And I thought, unfortunately, Linfield always got mentioned as the place women ought to go to find a good husband. That doesn't bode well for your academic enterprise. And Thankfully, over the years, that has changed. Certainly, Linfield's athletic reputation has always been very strong. I'm very proud of that, and I think it's a good thing because I think being a student athlete is probably a pretty good deal, and a lot of education occurs in the athletic realm. Over the last 20 or 25 years, Linfield has made a much stronger push to be more upfront about its educational opportunities. Certainly, the wide extent of international programs has become very well known. The fact that we have a number of PhDs, especially out of the sciences, that have gone on to get their PhDs has become more well publicized. The fact that we've had scholarship winners of national scholarships has been a rather remarkable record for Linfield. And the fact that over the past several years we continue to be mentioned in the best 100 or the top this or the top that as one of the outstanding institutions, not only in the state but in the country, I think bodes well for Linfield.
What do you think about sort of the perspective or the attitude toward higher education in general?
Well, higher education from time to time gets a bum rap from the public. It's the ivory tower syndrome, it's the privileged college kid concern, it's not so much at Linfield but at other institutions that those radical students acting up. So that higher education's public image has waxed and waned over the time that I've been here. It's been a rather long time. I don't think there's any question, though, that higher education at the collegiate level, especially among private colleges, provides much of the leadership in corporate America and political America. There's certainly very little question that it has great economic benefit for the folks who attend college. So I'm very hopeful that people will continue to have a high image for education in general.
I'd agree that it's waxed and waned through the years. We're certainly in a strange period right now where I think we're under fire a lot, particularly private liberal arts colleges, because of the expense of that kind of education. All these things coming out, like I hacked my own education, sort of books and that kind of thing. And it is expensive to get this kind of education, but I believe in it wholeheartedly. And I think there are still a number of statistics that will show that over the course of a lifetime, it's an investment in a future that's going to pay off. And I think as long as people really do their research, they'll see that too. So yeah, you can say it's going to cost you X number of dollars, but what's the benefit? And to create leaders that are well-rounded and can look at problems or challenges with a lot of different perspectives, and that can think critically and communicate well and understand the values and ethics with certain decisions. I think that's a great value, and in the long run, people are going to see that.
I want to bounce back for a second before we move on, and this is something that occurred to me just a second ago while you were talking about faculty and administration and the challenges of faculty and administration on campus. As someone who's been on both sides of that, how has it changed? Is it always the kind of the same fight with different words? How do things get done?
There has always been a rather healthy tension between faculty and administration. I've never fully understood that tension. I do know that I was here for 22 years as a professor only. As a faculty member, I was the chair of the Faculty Executive Council on a couple of occasions. I was the faculty representative to the Board of Trustees. I thought I had a pretty good relationship with my colleagues. I do know that when I became the Dean of Students, there was an immediate shift of attitude. There was some modest mistrust about my goals and aspirations, and that somehow inadvertently I became a them rather than a we, and it never made sense to me. One of the good things about being at a school the size of Linfield is you can deal with that in a pretty easy way. I think at some schools it's probably difficult to overcome the chasm that may exist between faculty and administration. I think we're agreed here that we're all working towards the same goal. There is understandable argument about allocation of resources being perceived differently by one side or the other, but I appreciate that in a community this size we resolve those issues.
Do you have a perspective on that, Debbie? Especially in the alumni office, which, at least from my perspective, is like the amazing dynamic office that touches every part of campus.
No, I'd concur. I think that's you're gonna find some of that tension on any campus. That's just the nature of the beast a little bit. I do think, people deal with it and overcome it on a personal level. So I can think of times that I've been on a hood to coast team running with several faculty members, and that us-them seems to disappear when you're all in a sweaty van overnight. Or part of it is fully understanding what each other does and the value to the institution. And our faculty work hard and have huge loads, and they do. And they do an amazing amount of work, and they're critical to the institution. So I don't know if they feel like the administrators understand that. But our administrators also work hard, and many of them get calls in the middle of the night when you're dean of students, or work events all weekend long, several weekends out of the year. And I don't know if our faculty understand that side. So there is a little bit of what is it you do exactly, and can it be as much as I'm doing? But I think that we are a small enough place that there are ways to cross that border.
One of the reasons I wanted to continue teaching was first because I love doing that. It's my favorite thing at the college. But the other reason was so that I could understand and continue to converse with faculty about it. I understand what it's like to be a faculty member, and hope that would have some measure of weight with them.
And I also love that you attend the administrators breakfast every month too. Yeah. So making sure that you're in that group as well.
Well, I enjoy the social interaction. That was a group that we began some years ago because we wanted to create more opportunity for administrators to interact with one another, because we're so spread across campus on so many different tasks. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to find some commonality, and a way to do that was to have some social interaction. So we have every first Wednesday of the month for several years now an administrators breakfast.
I'm curious, tell us about one. It'd be hard to choose one, of course. So one of your favorite moments at Linfield, an event, an interaction, something that happened that you particularly look back particularly fondly.
For me, there would be two. The first has to do with in a classroom one day, and I don't remember if it was a lecture or discussion, I mentioned a book that I was reading at the time. It happened to be an economic history book. And I was thrilled in the next couple of days to see one of my students walking across campus carrying that book. It had nothing to do with what we were doing in class. It was an outside thing, but it had some academic, educational element to it. And I thought, wow, I have impact on students in a way that I had not quite imagined. So for me, that would be one. The other is a somewhat famous story that gets told differently every time it's retold. And again, early on, Linfield was playing basketball over at Eastern Oregon in the final days of the season in order to win a berth to the national tournament. And several Linfield faculty and students carpooled over. And we got to Eastern Oregon. It was freezing at that time of year. On the way back, I had I think there was me and maybe one other faculty person and 3 students in the car. And unfortunately, in the Columbia River Gorge, we got pulled over by a state policeman. And I rolled down the window, and the state policeman came to the window and said, "Did you know you have a headlight out?" And I said, "No, I really did not. Did you know you also have a headlight out?" And he said, "Well, we'll just forget it, won't we?"
Okay, then I'm going to use 2 as well. It's only fair. I think one would be a few years ago when my father was asked to speak as the commencement speaker. And it was just a nice way I love commencement anyway. I'm hokey about those kinds of things. I've seen probably 40 Linfield commencements in my life and participated in various capacities. So I'm often an usher now through my role. But you were asked to give the commencement address because he was retiring, I guess, that year. And it was just neat to have that kind of be a culmination of years of experience at Linfield. My son was there to see him, so it was 3 generations connected to Linfield and what is one of our neater traditions of the year. Just thousands of people, a beautiful day, so I think I'll always remember that. And the other relates to Linfield but wasn't at Linfield. I have a friend, one of my best friends from college, who now lives in Glendale, Arizona, and that's very near Pasadena. And she was driving in her car, which happened to be sporting a Linfield alumni decal. And she said somebody next to her was honking like a wild person. And she said, now Debbie, you need to understand this isn't McMinnville, so you don't just roll down your window for anybody. But she looked over and the guy looked pretty seasoned and pretty harmless, so she rolled down her window and he leaned over and said, Linfield, class of 39. And she's class of 93. And so I just loved that they felt that commonality, even though they were years apart. They couldn't possibly have had any of the same professors, but the fact that it meant something to be connected to Linfield, and certainly in my position that's what we strive for. So I really like that memory.
By far the thing I enjoy the most is having students years later come back and say how important you were in their development or educationally or otherwise. I find that they often misrepresent what really occurred and don't remember it quite accurately, but I appreciate that they believe it was important and helpful, and that really makes it all worthwhile.
Going along those lines, are there any nuggets you could share as far as, and Debbie, you were a student here, as far as sort of the nostalgia, rose-tinted glasses, what you took away from your time as a student at Linfield?
Well, I spent a lot of my time in the theater, and so probably some of my fondest memories have to do with the theater, and more of them probably outside of the class than inside the class. But got to know professors very well, and some of those professors are still here today, so Ty and Brenda Marshall are a couple of those professors. We had road trips together when Linfield represented our it's in the ACTF, American College Theater Festival. So we'd get in vans and head over to Eastern Washington, and just that kind of an experience has some wonderful memories. Or when we all went to London on a January term course and we saw 15 plays in 21 days. That's hard to replicate afterwards. But I think, you know, it's just such an important time period in a person's life, kind of coming into your own, becoming independent, figuring things out, and to have the kind of community and environment we have here to do that in is such a luxury. And you don't realize that until you talk to people who didn't have that. And then you think, wow, I was pretty lucky to be able to make young adult mistakes in the comfort of Linfield's environment.
I have a follow-up question. Going along those lines and also referencing your story of the class of 39 alumni meets the class of 93, I have my own assumptions as the archivist in what I've viewed here so far, in what the identity, the Linfield identity was in the past and sort of what I perceive it to be now. I would love to hear your thoughts on what the Linfield identity was, what it is now, if in fact they're different.
I think it might be a little different, maybe along with the character of the college, but there's such a thread that's still there. I think our students are busy and active and engaged, and I think that's long been the case. I think our students are incredibly bright, but maybe weren't always the A+ students. They may have been the B+ students, but who are so active. That's probably part of the reason they're B+ students, because they're also athletes or do community service or do theater or work in the community. So I think that's maybe a part of the nature of Linfield. I think for a while it may have been not us against the world, but a little more of a pioneer spirit kind of thing that we maybe don't have quite as much of now as we used to at one point. But everybody has something in common they call the Linfield Experience. And the Linfield Experience looks very different for each student, even students that are here at the same time. And yet there's a feeling to it that I think does transcend the decades. That's, in talking to alumni, I get that all the time. And part of it, I think, is the closeness of the living environments here. The fact that we're a largely residential community helps with that. The closeness that they have with a mentor relationship with faculty member or many faculty members. I think that's a part of it, but it looks a little different for everybody.
I think common threads are the sense of community, sense of loyalty to the institution, intense loyalty in most cases. Almost every student in a Linfield Experience has a favorite professor or two with whom they are quite close, most often both in and out of the classroom. I think that in some ways the residential nature of the college becomes very common for most students and a shared experience. The athletic tradition of the institution is something that most students have experienced either as a fan or a player. the idea of a relatively broad education is a shared experience. The courses may not be exactly the same, but certainly the sense of being broadly educated is. In the 70s and 80s, the majority of our students were majoring in education, became teachers. In later years, the majority of our students have been majoring in business or nursing, if we include the Portland campus. So the nature of the academic enterprise has changed in terms of where students are located, in terms of their major, but in terms of the experience, I think there are many common threads.
And you mentioned that intense loyalty. I think that's something that I've noticed as well, and you guys are obviously an example of it, but the amount of legacies that are here, the amount of people who are who tell me that their parents went here, or grandparents went here, or both went here, does that seem an unusually high number to you as someone working with alumni?
I don't know what to compare it to based on other institutions, but I love it when I see that, because it certainly means that those alums had a good enough experience that they're at least content with their sons or daughters enrolling. And I've now been here long enough that some of the people I went to school with, their children are at Linfield. So I'm starting to see second generation folk, which is neat.
I was the Dean of Students and Vice President for Student Affairs and Athletics for half of my time period here. And it used to always kind of be fun when we would introduce our staff at various public events, how many of my staff were Linfield alums. You know, they had such a great experience at the college that they wanted to come back. There are currently on the faculty, I'm guessing somewhere between 6 and 9 students that I had in my class at some point who are now teaching at Linfield College. I've had, I think, a dozen of my students on the Board of Trustees. So students have a good enough experience that they want to come back and contribute to other students, new students having that experience.
Is there anything that we haven't asked you that we should have, or any stories that should go on the record?
Boy, I don't want any stories on the record, I don't think.
We're going to blur your face out.
That's right.
Yeah, I used my last lecture when I retired as an opportunity to tell those stories, so people can access those stories there.
I just think for me, and I think it's come out, but Linfield's so much about the people. You know, and when I was thinking, oh gosh, what could they possibly ask us? I just kept thinking so many of my memories, or what makes Linfield Linfield for me, are individuals or people. And I suppose the people are different for each of us, but you know, when I think of the TJ Days of the world who had such an impact on this college, people that were fiercely loyal and
about whom we say they bleed purple. And I could name a dozen folks off the top of my head that are that loyal.
And in my work especially, I mean, there's nothing greater than to hear from alumni who may have graduated 5 years ago, may have graduated 35 years ago, but so believe in Linfield and what we do, and that it was fundamental in who they are, that they email all the time, they come to games, they see us when we're on the road. I just think that reinforces for me what a great place this is.
And jointly for Debbie and I think we would say it's for Linfield has been much more than an employment situation for us. It's just part of our life.
Mm-hmm. I remember being in admission for years where we were trying to interest students in the college, and the director of admission saying to me, don't take it personally when they don't come here. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting Linfield. And I thought, I don't know that makes it any better for me because it's so much a part of who I am. I thought, no, that's still just as bad.
Where do you see Linfield going from here? What comes next? How will it be different in 20 years?
I don't think I can predict 20 years out in the future any more than I could have predicted 20 years ago what Linfield would be today. For me, as Debbie mentioned earlier, the biggest difference over that 40-year period for me has been resources. Students in some ways remain the same. Faculty in some ways remain the same, but the resources they have to work with collectively and together to gain an experience and an education are remarkably better than they were, and I assume that will continue to be the case. It's hard to imagine Linfield being any different because I don't know that I want it to be very different. Mm-hmm. It's been such a good experience for me, for my family, and for the students with whom I'm familiar that I don't want it to change very much. I'm not very good at predicting the future, I'm afraid.
And that kind of reminds me of a story actually from President Helly's inauguration. And I remember when he was talking about the inauguration, he had a story where he talked about the white post. And the white post, if you leave it alone for long, won't be a white post very long. Eventually it'll get dingy or dirty. You've got to keep applying paint to it. You've got to change. Sometimes you have to knock the white post down and start over. So after his inauguration, I went up and said, okay, I understand the analogy, but quit with the knocking the post down. That's really scary to me. We can paint the post, but don't knock it down. So I guess in that same way, it's hard for me to imagine because I don't want it to change too dramatically. But I suspect, you know, in 20 years, the campus might look a little bit different than it does now, because 20 years ago it certainly looked different, and technology may play a little bit of a different role. Although I think what makes Linfield so valuable is the face-to-face human interaction, and people jointly sitting together in a class it's still very valuable.
Or outside of the classroom.
Right, so I hope we don't lose the connectivity in that way.
Well, I have a little piece of history here that Tiara pulled for us.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
Nice.
This is a picture that took place in Debbie's first year at the college. I was a young faculty member with hair. It was in Ted Wilson Gymnasium. It was in
Yeah.
Riley Gymnasium.
Riley Gym.
It was in Riley Gymnasium during a basketball game. There used to be a section there called the South 40. And students like to get in that section and be noticeably available during the game and comment on the officiating and other team from time to time.
Often an interesting dress.
Yeah.
I showed this picture to my son. He
Handsome-looking
thought it was him. So, yeah. I don't remember that, Mom. Well, that wasn't you. That was me.
And who did you think I was?
I had no idea. No idea.
Some unknown individual. Yeah.
Him and Amy. Yeah.
Well, I think we've asked all the questions that we wanted to ask. So if there's no other lingering stories for you, we can go ahead and close the interview. And thank you both so much.
Thank you both very much.
Taking the
Thanks.
time and talking with us.
Thank you.